Pour écouter cette session en français, veuillez cliquer en bas de votre écran sur l'onglet Interprétation et sélectionner le drapeau français.
Hello, bonjour.
Barry Saleho.
On behalf of ICLEI Africa,
the African Center for Cities,
Our Future Cities,
Red Cross Crescent Climate Center,
and partners,
we're excited to welcome all of you
to the Rise Africa 2022 Action Festival.
Rise Africa has been growing since 2020
as a platform for thinkers,
doers,
and enablers,
committed to inspiring action for sustainable cities.
This year's theme is
creativity.
For me, this means blending skills to be able to communicate the climate change complexity in rapidly urbanizing cities.
I think we have such untapped potential in Africa when it comes to creativity. There's so much about Africa that is yet to be told.
There are so many people in the African continent who have a huge skill base and are creative in the way they approach challenges.
Creativity in Africa is about embracing our own. It's about dynamism and it's about embracing our indigenous knowledge.
I think agency is finding ways of giving power back to people, to groups, to young people, especially on a continent where it's a very young population.
I like the approach of bringing everyone together, right? It doesn't necessarily need to be this expert, this high-ranking official.
I think what agency means to me is change from the ground up.
The importance of urgency is the recognition of the past and the recognition that we've lost time.
Urgency is about acting now to build more inclusive, productive, and resilient cities.
There's this need to creatively redesign and unlearn and explore new ways of thinking.
The festival is hosting 33 sessions
with 135 provocateurs from across Africa and the world.
Every session aims to show new ideas,
showcase ongoing action,
and launch new initiatives, bringing participants together
to chart a new route forward.
We hope that the festival program will inspire you.
At the festival, we encourage you to showcase your business and projects,
build lasting partnerships,
unleash your creative potential,
commit to sustainable action.
Rise Africa is about translating ideas into action. What actions are you going to commit to this festival?
Before the session begins, it is important to note that you're being recorded.
And by participating, you are given the consent to be recorded.
All recordings will be available on the program page after the festival. Creative expression is vital for creating new futures for our cities.
And so we invite you to enter this session in the spirit of creativity and dreaming.
I don't expect you to clown yourselves and collapse the distance and difference between sharing bread and sharing bed. I know that feeling, so give me a break and stop the fake. They say a hungry man is an angry man, but I say I am not hungry, I am hunger. I am not angry, I am anger. I am not dangerous, I am danger. I am an abominable time bomb, able to blast limestones and thunderbolts because somehow I am torn, tried and tired. So you see, you don't have to hear the sound of my voice before you know that hunger is real, scarcity is not. So please, check the time. It's history time, passion time, meaning time, access time, free flow time, sharing time, bread time, your time, my time, our time. Now, oh, now is urgent time.
Bongiwe Simka, a professional officer at ICLEI Africa, working within the biodiversity, nature, and health workstream, where we assist local governments and cities to adopt green-blue infrastructure solutions to interpret global biodiversity and sustainability targets and find innovative ways to mainstream nature-based solutions. I have had the pleasure of coordinating and organizing this session today, Africa's Leadership in Nature-Based Solutions. Is language creating a barrier and showcasing the continent's best efforts? Agency, that is today's theme, agency, and how fitting our session is. Action, momentum, and the power to drive change and be instrumental in moving our societies towards a more sustainable course. And before we start, I would like to briefly introduce our moderator and our amazing speakers who will be driving this discussion today and giving us insights into the experiences within the context of nature-based solutions in Africa. So our session today will be moderated by Professor Pippen Anderson. So Pippen is an associate professor, lecturer, and director of graduate studies in the Department of Environmental and Geographical Science at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. And Pippen's research focus is on growing our understanding on nature-based solutions in the African space and in urban ecology. We also have a great suite of speakers representing research, policy, practice, advocacy, among others. Our first speaker is Professor Shreeb Lwasa. So Shreeb is an urban geographer and associate professor at Makerere University in Uganda, where he works on adaptation and mitigation possibilities for transformative urban development. We then have Jessica Kavanagh. Jess recently joined C40 Cities, where she leads C40's implementation work across Africa. So Jess's work focuses on improving urban human well-being and building climate resilience through influencing policies and planning systems. We then have Mrs. Veronica Josephine Fortune. I'm not sure if she's joined our session yet, but Veronica is from Sierra Leone and is the first female chief administrator for the Bo City Council, where she has steered the ship fruitfully by tackling waste management issues, environmental protection issues, and gender mainstreaming, among other things. We then have Franklin Karimi. Franklin is a senior design associate at the Concrete Design Initiative, the KDI, and is based in Nairobi. So Frank is an architect with an interest in the role that designers and architects play in creating more socially inclusive urban landscapes. And last, but definitely not least, we're joined by Dr. Pel Gola. So Dr. Pel works for the South African National Biodiversity Institute, where she leads and coordinates the Umgeni Ecological Infrastructure Partnership, the UEIP, which is a multi-stakeholder program committed to integrating ecological infrastructure solutions in addressing challenges related to water security. So a very warm welcome to our session lead and to all our speakers and to everyone who's joined us today. And I think before we start and I hand over to Pippen later on, I think as a reminder, please keep your mics on mute if you are not talking. Please make use of the chat box for any questions, comments you might have. And even better, you're welcome to raise your hand for any questions or insights you might want to add to this discussion. There is French interpretation for the session. So please do click on the interpretation icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen to get access to that. And yeah, as a reminder again, the session is being recorded. So you need to be mindful of that. And yeah, and I think as a means of introduction and setting the scene for today's session, I'll be playing some introductory videos just to introduce the topic of today, nature-based solutions. What are these nature-based solutions that everyone is talking about and why are they important? Why are we even having this discussion? So I will play this video now and introduce our topic.
My name is Ingrid Kutsia. I work for ICLEI Africa and I'm based in Cape Town. And my main responsibility here is about biodiversity and nature-based solutions in cities. I manage projects here on the African continent as well as globally. And I'm going to talk to you today about nature-based solutions, what they are, why they're important, how we can apply them, and what their benefits are. So the first point I want to discuss with you is, why are nature-based solutions important? And to understand this, or to answer this question, we need to understand the interconnectedness and the relationship between climate change, nature, and people, and how we as people, whether we live in big cities or small cities, depend on nature for our livelihoods, for our food, for our health, and our well-being. And the important thing to know is that nature provides many benefits. These include raw materials, it includes water, it also includes medicinal resources. That's where we get most of our medicines from. But it includes also other types of services and goods that we can use, and that in fact we do use in our daily life as we work and live and play in cities. And I'm thinking here, for example, of the trees that line the streets and the parks, which provide us with a place not only to recreate, but to also cool down the streets. Nature also plays a role in regulating air quality, in helping to prevent or attenuate floods. And here I think of wetlands. And if you live along the coast in a coastal city, you will understand well how something like a mangrove prevents these extreme or reduces actually the impact of extreme weather events and surge events on the coastline. So nature is an important part of providing people and urban communities with the means in which to live a healthy and sustainable life. And nature-based solutions are important because they provide us with the solutions to address many of the challenges that we find in cities that will safeguard both nature and society. The next point I want to make is to define or to talk a little bit about what are nature-based solutions. This is a term that has been used in all kinds of circles as far as climate and nature and health is concerned. And there are many definitions. One of the most common definitions has been defined by the IUCN. I'm not going to bore you with definitions, but what I want you to understand is that nature-based solutions are about taking actions that address specific societal and even economic challenges. And the third point I want to make about when we say what is a nature-based solution is to understand that ultimately it is something that will effectively and in an adaptive way provide benefits as far as biodiversity and human well-being is concerned. And in the slide in front of you, there's a diagram that shows in the middle are the societal challenges, and around it are the different types of nature-based solutions. And there are many. You will come across things like ecosystem-based approaches, green or gray, blue infrastructure, etc. These are all different types that fall under the umbrella of nature-based solutions.
Now that we know what nature-based solutions are, what benefits do they provide and why are they so important?
So something else that I want to talk about is the benefit that we have in that nature-based solutions provides us with options that are more cost-effective than many of our grey infrastructure solutions. You have two pictures in front of you. The one is of a typical grey infrastructure. It's a wastewater treatment, and you can see the ponds, and it's huge, and it costs a lot of money to maintain infrastructure like this. On the left hand, there is a picture of what looks like just an open grassland. It is in fact what we call a sustainable urban drainage system, where in this particular case, they have used nature and the natural sinks such as wetlands and such as planting plants that clean the wastewater to deal with wastewater. Now, the interesting thing to understand is that nature-based solutions are often cheaper because they provide services that are free, that come from nature. And this is important when it gets to the maintenance of infrastructure. Many of the communities in our cities, particularly the most vulnerable and the poor communities, are not able to afford these important or expensive services such as clean water and sewerage. And if we use a cheaper option, such as a nature-based solution, we're able to provide these very important basic services to all of our communities. The last thing I want to talk about is to just reflect a little bit again on the benefits of nature-based solutions. I hope that you can see now what the practical application worth is and why they're important. So let's focus again on the benefits. I've just talked about the cost efficiencies, but there's another point that I want to make, and that's linked to the cost efficiencies in some respects. Nature-based solutions also provide job creation opportunities, and they can support livelihoods, but it also provides a way in which we can sustain and support livelihoods because it provides us with the natural resources to maybe gather reeds or medicinal plants or food from our cities. The other thing I think that we need to understand is that nature-based solutions provide us with a no-regrets opportunity. And it also provides us with a biodiversity net gain, which is very important in this time where we are challenged by loss of our nature and our natural resources and the impacts it has on climate change. And it provides us with resilience. So while we learn about green infrastructure in our schools and our universities, these are important. They do give us certain tools, but we need to remember that there are options and solutions that nature provides us that we can use to create better cities and to provide us with the infrastructure and services that will improve our quality of life as well as make us more resilient communities.
With that said, I think we have a great foundational basis for today's debate. I will now hand over to Pippen to lead us in this discussion. Over to you, Pippen. Thank you.
Thanks, Bongi. Lovely to kick off with a great showcasing of ICLEI's stellar products. I think those were lovely start-off videos, like points of departure. So thanks so much for those. I think it's really interesting to talk about language. If you speak to any parent, they will remember a time, the child won't remember, but a parent will remember a time when they spoke another language to the other parent so that the children couldn't understand what was being said. We keep secrets in languages. So it's interesting to think about language as, we think of language as a means of communication, but language is also a way of excluding people. You know, like I said, the parenting example, my husband and I used to speak in Afrikaans to our children, not to them, to each other, when we didn't want them to understand. And I think any parenting team will know that. We use technical language, and that often excludes lay people. Academic language is full of jargon as well. It can be very exclusionary. Sometimes speaking to someone in their own language, when it's not your language, is a way of holding them in a certain position as well. So we use language all the time to make these little clubs. Some people are in on that club of language and some people are out. And sometimes we do it overtly because we don't want somebody to know something, and sometimes we do it inadvertently. And sometimes we think we're doing something good, perhaps by learning another person's language, but in that way we enter their world and they're not allowed in our world. So it's an interesting sort of club creating thing, and it's a very powerful thing. I think it's really important to understand that language and terminology and jargon and how we use language, which is so embedded in culture, is very, very powerful. So I think it's fantastic that we're having a conversation today around language. And our intention here is to explore a very particular story around language or terminology as it relates to the work that we all do. And this work broadly relates to nature, biodiversity conservation, human well-being, sustainability, and all under this umbrella of the fact that we're situated in a time of crisis, in a time of change. And I think to look at language as it threads through that journey that we're all going through, sort of in parallel, but in these broad sort of nature conservation, social spaces is interesting. Here we explore nature-based solutions in particular, and I think Ingrid's introduction was really useful. So nature-based solutions as a term that captures action in response to challenge, action that is effective, action that is adaptive, and action that speaks to biodiversity and social solutions. So it's a little term, nature-based solutions, but it's carrying a lot on its back. And of course, critical to this conversation is it comes hot on the heels of blue-green infrastructure, ecosystem services, economic valuation, all sorts of other cultural valuation, ecosystem-based adaptation, ecosystem-based approaches, etc., etc. So enter the sort of new kid on the block, and let's start talking about language and terminology. And when I say language, I mean it both in the broadest sense, as in, you know, I speak English, you speak French, you speak Swahili, sort of vernacular, and then I also mean in terms of terminology. And I think in this space we can unpack it with respect to both. We're going to pick up this particular story around language as it pertains to the context of the African continent. So Africa is depicted as crisis-ridden, dramatically underrepresented in the academic literature, generally dictated to in terms of theory from the global north. It is probably the continent with the most extant or remnant nature on it still, which I think is something important to keep in mind. It's growing rapidly, and it is feeling climate change impacts already. So today we're going to ask, how does the story of language or terminology speak into how Africa is positioned or perceived to be positioned in this particular nature-based solutions or nature, conservation, society, well-being, etc. space. We've got a lovely panel. So I'm going to kick off by posing a question to them first. But I thought it would be just important to say, this is a conversation and we would love you all to participate. If you have something you would like to share, or you'd like to ask a question of one of the panelists or more than one of the panelists, can you do the little hand raising thing? You can look for the little step, or you can put a question in the chat. Between Bongi and myself, we're going to try and make sure that these are picked up on. It's not always easy in an online space to do that. Okay, so over to my panel. What I'd like to ask of you as a sort of first point of departure is if you could share something from your own experience of what nature-based solutions or various other terminology in the space has meant for you in your workspace. So you may have a theory or a view about how language is used in the space. You may have an anecdote of a particular experience. So it's a kind of open sharing opportunity. But I think that would be useful in terms of starting the conversation. When you first speak, if you could just remind us again of your professional capacity, because I think that is quite pertinent to the conversation. And let's kick off with Schwabe. If you could jump in, I would be grateful.
Yeah, thank you, Pippen. My name is Schwabe Ruasa. I'm an urban geographer and spatial planner. And as introduced earlier, I have worked a long time at Makerere University as an academic who straddles academic science and practice in many ways, which is the basis of the few remarks I'm going to make about language in the context of nature-based solutions and what's happening to Africa. I just would like to start off by referring to two potentially influential pieces on ecosystem services in general and planetary health. And that is one is the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which, as we remember and could be knowing, had very specific terminology and language around services categorized as provisioning, supporting, regulatory, and cultural. And the second one is the IPBES Global Assessment, which is most recent, that has kind of elevated the discourse around ecosystem services and introduced nature's contribution to people. So NCP is the new terminology and language, which is framed around nature-based solutions as earlier defined by Ingrid. And in there, it is understandable that the recent IPBES report is very clear about the importance of biodiversity conservation and enhancement. So you can think of it as Attenborough's notion of rewilding the earth, but also very important in addition to biodiversity is the carbon storage and the power of nature to help store more carbon and stabilize the planetary climate system. And we can also not forget the importance of nature in resilience building, or in resilience of both human systems, but also natural ecosystems. So it's very important to underline that the language between these two pieces has transformed, as I said, from very kind of specific, and from the African academy point of view, we had started to get some stability in workings around provisioning, supporting, regulatory, because a lot of these could directly be measured and you could actually kind of track the progress in enhancing any of these ecosystem services. But now we have NBS, or nature-based solutions, and nature's contribution to people, a language which has also been recently adopted by UN, and with the definition of NBS and the new terminology and metrics for ecosystem services, it's very important to underline that. So I would not be very surprised, as Pippen mentioned earlier, that part of this language, given where Africa sits in leadership on nature-based solutions, as I'll give an example later, it can be exclusionary. And the reason I emphasize exclusionary is because, having participated in global assessments, including IPCC and partly IPBES, a lot what we see coming from the literature that is assessed in peer-reviewed publications is considered to be quote unquote noise. Noise, why? Because it is hard, at least from a particular positionality, to get any synthesis around very micro level studies in Africa, and how for a long time in terms of practice around integrated water and soil management systems. So you can think of very specific applications like mulching, sand damming, agroforestry in rural environments, but also in cities, the role of biophilia that is now also extended into urban and peri-urban agriculture and forestry to transcend just being biophilic in nature has very much been assessed, but still very dotted at micro level in terms of studies. And that is considered to be noise, because you can hardly synthesize and be able to craft new terminology like nature-based solutions. So it worries me in the cities. Many African cities are still greener cities compared to a lot of cities around the world, which underscores the point that for a long time, Africa has been practicing different forms of nature-based solutions as actions for benefit of society, but perhaps much less in terms of measuring benefits of the health and well-being of the planetary system. And that is, again, very much within the new terminology that was approved by UN about ecosystem services measuring, where we have less contribution on that. So my call as I close this is to really be very proactive in pushing the leadership of Africa around nature-based solutions. We should push back on the touted specialist field of nature-based solution, which Africa has much longer term experience. we should push back around the standards that are likely to come. And I know this is most likely going to come around nature-based solutions that will be exclusionary and create these expert fields that would allow a continuous hegemony of North-South relations in terms of expertise. I think there's a lot of expertise in Africa, in cities, but also in different places. And we should also push back a lot around professionalization of nature-based solutions through academy. So very soon we are going to start seeing courses introduced around nature-based solution ecosystem services, but yet we have long-term master's, bachelor's courses on integrated water and soil management, agroforestry, sustainable agriculture, spatial and land use planning, integrated urban planning that actually embraces the value of ecosystem services and nature. So I would like to end there by saying that we need to be proactive in pushing the leadership of Africa around NBS. Thank you, Pippen. Over back to you.
Thanks, Shoaib. Lots of interesting thoughts to chew on there. I've made some notes. I'm going to come back to you on various things, but I'm going to push on. Let's jump south. Jess Kavonik, would you like to give your view?
Yeah, thanks, Pips. And so great to see so many familiar faces and names. As another means of introduction, I am a practitioner, and I'm currently the head of implementation in Africa for C40. But I have been working with African cities for many years, about 8 years, in really trying to advance mainstreaming of nature and nature-based solutions into governance systems, planning systems, and financial kind of systems and mechanisms, and really have had the honor of being part of the Urban Natural Assets for Africa program, which I know that the session is aligned to. So it's really great to be a part of that. And very early on, under the UNO program, we brought various people together, various stakeholders. So community members, private sector, financiers, NGOs, community-based organizations, city officials, and national governments, all together in kind of a co-production or co-exploration learning lab to really kind of define action areas for nature-based solutions in those cities. And so I kind of wanted to start by just telling a story of what came out of those sessions. And the session was aimed around looking at terminology actually and unpacking the meaning and what people related to and what they understood. So we'd have a number of different cards with different words on them and various kind of categories. And all these range of different people, different stakeholders had to place the words into these various categories and then really kind of unpack why they had placed that and what that category meant to them or what that word meant to them. So it's very aligned with this actual session. And there's kind of 5 key areas or messages that came out of that session. And this was a long time ago, so there's probably 45 different messages, but I can only kind of remember 5 key ones. And the first one was language matters. I don't think there's anyone in the session that won't disagree with that. But what was also very clear is that meaning matters just as importantly as language. So what is the meaning behind that choice of word or that choice of terminology? And giving the space to people to really unpack what they meant by the word that they chose was really, really transformational and really led to kind of all coming together and getting on the same page in terms of designing action around nature-based solutions. The second kind of key message I remember was that the language or the use of terminology mattered more to people that held more responsibility or held more power. And that obviously kind of might be a simple one, a simple understanding. Those that are going to get their head kind of chopped off if they make the wrong decision, obviously are much more careful around the terminology or the language they used. But that was a very interesting kind of tension area that emerged in that space. The third one, there was this kind of also another kind of tension area that emerged, was a lot of people that had less responsibility felt that sometimes the use of words or the language used was sometimes a barrier or used as an excuse for delay. And that was interesting to how do we, within the space that there is complexity around what word you use, what language you use, but how do we still kind of all move towards action together? And it's not used as kind of a delay in decision making. And the fourth one was that you really need to curtail the use of the language, use of terminology to your audience. So, for example, your political arm of local governments versus the technical arm, what language they were using, what language they could relate to, could understand. And also a big one is financiers and private sector. And I think that's also key with the donors now using nature-based solutions as such a keyword, and maybe you relate to ecosystem-based adaptation as a method, or kind of you relate to it stronger. But are you going to curtail your language for the funder or for somebody you're engaging with? And how important is that understanding what other people use so that you can meet them kind of halfway? And then my last kind of key message is around when we were kind of, and this is linking with Schwab's kind of understanding that nature-based solutions have been around for a while in Africa. And when we were discussing what they were and unpacking that meaning, there was a lot of aha moments in the room of, oh, we're already doing this. We're already on the right track. And there was kind of a discussion about now it's just packaged in a way that can easily be grasped and taken forward, and almost liberated the room a bit to say we are on the right track. And yet there was this general feeling that, oh, we've been doing this forever and we've got so much more to show than other people, or other people that have crafted that terminology. So I'll end there, and yeah, really looking for more exciting debate.
Thanks, Jess. Super to have some insights coming out of your ever engaged workshop methods. That's really fantastic. I'm going to jump north again. Franklin, could we have your views?
Thank you so much, Pippen. Thanks to my fellow panelists as well. I'm glad to be part of this panel. I'm a landscape architect and also the senior design associate at KDI, which is an international nonprofit in Sweden, the US, and here in Kenya. And I'll be sharing, particularly for this session, my experience working in Nairobi. And I think the topic around use of language and communication actually resonates quite well with my work, which is on participatory planning, talking to the community and connecting the community to be able to develop solutions around the needs identified. And in particular, I'll be talking about a project that we're working on, which is called RUNBS, which is a term we use for the word realizing urban nature-based solutions. And this particular project focuses on the application of nature-based solutions for wastewater management, contextualized for informal settlements, starting in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, and this sister project to the ICLEI UNA program. So the term nature-based solutions, and I think I'll derive my examples from this particular project. It is quite new, and sort of like all these seem to be very new terms, even for my colleagues in the office. But we quickly realized that this is something that we've been doing in the past several years, with using creative methods of nature-based solutions in the construction of community public spaces at a small scale. But the direct translations of the term or even the solutions that can be mentioned as types of nature-based solutions. The translations to that is used here within the neighborhoods that we work in are almost in existence. And I'll also talk to the fact that this project, we're also working in Dar es Salaam in Kenya. And the kind of Swahili that we speak here in Kenya, which is quite popular, but also has a slang version, is quite different from the one that we speak that is spoken in Dar es Salaam. And I think I want to give an example, particularly from the kickoff session that we had of this project with our Tanzanian counterpart, CCI, that work in Dar es Salaam. Is when we started to think about, can we coin a term that right from when you mention it to the people that we work with, we already know, probably would be the difficult one. And we found it very difficult to develop this term. So for example, the word nature in Swahili is asilia, which in Dar es Salaam is well understood. but in Kenya, it's particularly very new. I actually first heard of it in the kickoff. So we found that what became particularly critical under this project as an objective is to develop a narrative that explains what NBS is and what are the benefits and how it works. And it was also particularly important for the participatory approach, where we need to involve key stakeholders of different levels to either inform them or even involve them closely for the co-design and the information sharing workshops or sessions that we had. So we sort of resorted to using stories and examples to explain NBS, and I'll try and reiterate what the previous speakers have mentioned, that it's not new. The use of nature is not very new to, in Africa or in the people living in our cities. And for that reason, as we can see them in their areas, and that was very easy for them to relate to, and relating, human systems as what happens within the city dwellings and the towns here. And using that example, we were able to, that helps bring the comparison, the challenges that we see, such as flooding and pollution within the cityscape, and looking at what happens in the rural areas or within those natural environments as things that we would want to emulate and want to copy, and that helped develop. Particular from one of the workshops, I remember the community developing or mentioning something in the lines of Njia za Kimungu Mungu, which directly translates to God's way, and that helped talk about the way the community understood that nature-based solutions sort of connect nature into a form of divinity, and that helped develop that definition. I think another way that was a language is the use of graphics and pictures, and we've seen this through our work. I think the way we've communicated our work is using before and after pictures of the transformation, and the use of graphics and before and after pictures became a way of communicating what NBS is, and it's not as simple as pulling out graphics from the internet and illustration. We really had to do a sort of contextualized graphics and using pictures of past works to new communities that we were developing the solutions with. And then function. I think I would also want to mention that being able to build practical solutions, being able to build solutions and having communities come and see how NBS works or what NBS is, what Jess was mentioning, have moments, which is, you're realizing that, oh, this is what you meant, or this is how it works. And that has been integral to communicate nature-based solutions. I think I'll mention a bit more our work around that as we continue the discussion. Back to you, Pippen.
Thanks so much, Franklin. Really interesting insights about the same language and deviation in a very local space as well. Super, thanks so much. Jumping back south again, Pearl, would you like to share your thoughts with us?
Right, thank you. So as already mentioned, my name is Pearl Gola. I am an ecological infrastructure coordinator. So I'm stressing that because I'm going to come back to it in terms of language. So I'm the coordinator for the Greater Umgeni catchment. I'm also going to come back to that in terms of language. So the focus really of my work as the ecological infrastructure coordinator for the catchment, I work under a global environmental facility funded project that is led by the South African National Biodiversity Institute. It is called Ecological Infrastructure for Water Security. That is what the project is called, and we're looking at through this project, unlocking biodiversity benefits and ecosystem services in development finance in the water value chain. So we specifically looking at managing and maintaining ecological infrastructure for water security benefits, and specifically our implementation is in the Greater Umgeni catchment. So we basically looking at interventions at a catchment scale. And these interventions are interventions by various key role players and stakeholders in the catchment. So we basically trying to coordinate what everybody's doing in terms of managing ecological infrastructure across the catchment. So that's the crux and the core of my work. And I relatively work across the research policy implementation continuum. So I kind of jump across that entire continuum. So people call me a pre-academic. So in terms of language, so I guess I'll start with ecological infrastructure. So it's a fairly new concept and probably most commonly used in South Africa than anywhere else. What it really is referring to is naturally functioning ecosystems that provide benefits to people. So people being the main focus. So in my view, that really does translate to nature-based solutions in terms of managing and maintaining ecological infrastructure. And when we talk ecological infrastructure, our examples are our wetlands, our catchments, our mountains, rangelands, all of those ecosystems. And we're looking at maintaining and managing them so that people can benefit from them. So that is the crux of the work that we do. So in terms of language, as I said, ecological infrastructure in short we call EI. So EI is quite a new concept, a concept that has sort of like its roots in South Africa. And we've actually, as Sandy, we've made a concerted effort to actually mainstream this concept across the different sectors. And the project that I'm involved in particularly concentrate in the water sector. So mainstreaming ecological infrastructure in the water sector in particular, and looking in particular at ecological infrastructure as a supplementary approach or an alternative approach to built infrastructure or gray infrastructure. So we all know that there's quite a bias towards built infrastructure, particularly in the water sector. We've got a number of huge dams that have been constructed for the last 100 or more years. And those dams are meant to really enable and facilitate water service delivery. So what we're trying to, the message that we're trying to get across with ecological infrastructure is the fact that ecological infrastructure also plays a role in the water delivery, in the water service delivery. So when you think about it, it's your ecological infrastructure that supplies water. What your built infrastructure does is it stores water and distributes it. So what we're trying to say is if we are going to be investing in built infrastructure, as we have been in the last 100 years or more, we should actually be looking at investing in ecological infrastructure as well, because that supports your built infrastructure. And when we're talking investment, we're also talking about investing in terms of financial resources and also investing in terms of our human resources, because we know that money doesn't do the work, it's people that do the work. So we actually do have to capacitate our people in terms of managing and maintaining ecological infrastructure. So so mainstreaming this concept of ecological infrastructure obviously does come with its own implications in terms of language, because first of all, it's a new concept. And secondly, as we work through maintaining ecological infrastructure and managing it and restoring it in some areas, we've actually gravitated into working with our communities. And when you get to a community and you want to be talking about ecological infrastructure, obviously a Zulu speaking elder will ask you what that is. So we've had to come up with a Zulu sort of like translation of ecological infrastructure, which we haven't tried out yet, because it still sounds a bit, yeah. So we've called it Ingqalasizinda Yemvelo. It's still sounding a bit, so it's still gonna, bring more questions in terms of us taking that to our, to our rural communities and saying this is what we mean by ecological infrastructure. But this is something that we're doing so that communication with our communities becomes easier. And because as we communicate with our communities in implementing the work that we do, we obviously use the language that they use. So I think that's it from me for now. Yeah.
Thanks, Pearl. Wonderful to get those insights in that, what you call it, pracademic. You've given us a new, and a whole new word. Can I just check if Veronica is in the room? She appeared and then I think she disappeared. Veronica, are you with us? Okay, not to worry. My understanding is that Veronica is very stretched across different commitments. It's a pity, but we will march on.
Yes, well, we are. Hello, Pippen. Let me talk later, please. Yes, I'm in engagement, like I told you. You can hear from the background. Let me talk to you later, please.
Okay, sure. Nice
yeah, let me talk
later.
later.
Take care.
Yeah.
But it's not now about original. Oh, you're going to need to mute again. Super. Okay. Present, but not participating for now. I thought that was a fantastic first round. That was really, so many things came up. Just with across the speakers we already had 2 additional terms thrown in. Shweb mentioned nature's contribution to people, NCP, and then Pearl talked about ecological infrastructure as well. Just a reminder that there's so many different terms swirling around in this space. Very wide-ranging conversations. Franklin invoked divinity and the power of graphics. Shweb, I think, raises really interesting questions around theory and where is it coming from? And then we get the sort of global to local perspective. Jess talked about hierarchies of power and the importance of language across those spectrums. And then I think both Jess and Pearl talked about language in terms of engaging across different sectors, particularly with funders, etc. All sorts of things came up. I've got lots of notes here, but I wondered if I would pick up on just one thread, because I'm interested, this came up in a few of your reflections. There's a very strong narrative that Africa's already doing this. We're already doing nature-based solutions work. We already understand ecosystem services. It's embedded in the continent in a way of daily practice. So my question back to the group, the panel, if we're doing this all along, how can we better showcase it? Or are we doing it and calling it something else? Where is it? So my feeling is that it's not, this is our understanding, but this is not a global understanding. How are we falling short in showcasing this particular strength, which has been sort of mired and covered up in terminology, perhaps? Who would like to jump in first? Thoughts on that one? Is it too difficult? I mean, it's a common theory that we're doing it. Franklin, you've unmuted yourself. Would you like to give it a go?
Yeah, sure. Also, I understand my network might be a bit poor, so I might also need to mute my video, if that changes anything.
Sure.
I think for our case, I think one of the things is, sharing these examples a bit more and thinking about which platforms help share this, and quite often trying to build upon the terminologies that are being used by the people we're working with, and not trying to introduce a new terminologies. And I think for our case, we've had, you have situations where you really want to talk about, say, rainwater harvesting, and there's not really a direct translation to that, but there is a way that the community speak, and they have had these interventions with them for a long time, and they have a language around that. And I think maybe the best way is using those words that exist among the people and use that to develop like an understanding of it, and building that up and growing that even into the academic spheres. And the other thing around that is also using the way people understand the solutions as a way to explain the functionality of them, and that helps contextualize. And I'm glad that we're working on this, and a lot of this is existent, which means there's already context to it, and that can help share that. I think the other way is being able to take pictures. I'm really an advocate of graphics and pictures. Take pictures, tell the stories. Have this as as stories or poetry, or use them as in murals. And I think we're in the process of doing that as well, trying to collect all this into our website, into our webpage, and also trying to collect this even in videos and putting them up in platforms that are accessible to everyone. And I think one of the challenges we faced as a barrier when we were developing this webpage to share some of the solutions and the processes that we're using to co-develop the solutions between Nairobi and Dar es Salaam was which language do we use, which terms do we use, who will access this if we start using these terms that we're getting from documents and from the academic spheres. And we quickly realized that we have to sort of use the words that we've used in developing the solution, the words that we use through the co-development, through the community engagement. The way we've broken down the solutions is how we will sort of continue to have that conversation from that level, and that will help bring out even other types of solutions that exist within the neighborhoods and within the communities that could come up into the bracket of the ecosystem-based adaptation or approaches.
Thanks, Franklin. Really lovely insights. And I'm so glad that you reiterated terminology, graphics again, because I think that that's a really critical one. Jess, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think kind of a few of my thoughts on this about, we're already doing it is maybe at what scale. So I think there's a lot of feedback, like communities, and that's why where Franklin, has got lots of his expertise is at the community level. I think, as a means to address flooding or in their community nature-based solutions. So when you talk to decision makers, they're like, we're doing it already, because they also are community members for half their lives. But my question is how much is it mainstreamed into decision making, and how much is it the actual go-to to address flooding at a larger scale at a city level? And I think that's where we're really struggling. So although it can easily be understood and we're doing this, it's like, are you actually doing it in governance and decision making? And then I think added to that is then also potentially the donors. So I don't want to throw any kind of funders or donors under the bus, but some may have an affinity for great infrastructure over blue-green infrastructure, purely because it's easy to be bankable. It's easier to understand the return on investment. And so does that put our cities in a decision, in a pathway to use those that are easily more quantifiable than nature-based solutions? So that's also probably why, although we're doing it already, it's not enough. So those are kind of just my two little musings on that. Thanks.
Super useful, Jess. And of course, scale also goes back to some of Schwab's original points. So you're talking about scaling up for policy, but scaling up for theory as well. You know, if we're wanting to make a sort of continental contribution, I wonder if Schwab has any thoughts on that. Schwab?
Yeah, thank you once again. Thanks for the great input from the colleagues on the panel. I just want to bring another point in the spirit of complementarity here. I mean, picking up from Franklin's point of anecdotal evidence about what benefits coming out of nature-based solutions or community and the expression of that. I think if we're going to position the leadership of Africa on nature-based solutions, and don't get me wrong, nature-based solutions are also elsewhere globally, it's not just Africa. We also have to kind of frame the contributions in a way that other areas have framed and measured nature's contribution to people. By that, I mean, if there is any green infrastructure that is contributing to reduction of flooding in the city, what is that contribution and how do we measure that? And how can we actually maintain some kind of continual monitoring of this? And that can help us to bring the data into the discourse and on the table to discussion in respect to policy and scaling up. But most importantly for me, it helps to scale up the theorization, but it also helps to position nature-based solutions in Africa at a global scale, what I call noise. So you move from noise, multiple dotted micro studies, to data that you can synthesize. And just you can allow me to mention the project by ICLEI that was highlighted by Ingrid on Una Rivers, where we're looking at possibilities for enhancing capacities of municipalities to start with very basic data on natural assets in cities, even if it's simply geocoding trees, or it is simply understanding the participatory flood line, which can then be measured in the next rain season to see what differences there are and can be related to the intensity of the storms. Then you can start to get data which you can use to distill and discern the contribution of that piece of infrastructure to flood reduction, or the other way around in terms of enhancing or increasing the frequency and intensity of that particular flood. So the point I'm raising here is that we have to start framing the long-standing contribution of nature to people in Africa, to economies in Africa, in the same or in a similar way that other regions have been tracking a lot of this and have data on which most of these policies that start from international level translate to national level, which is why perhaps the language of the policymakers and the language between technical people and policymakers differs, because they listen a lot from what is coming from UN and what's coming from international organization, and less from the noise coming from the multiple studies that we have. And that is because we don't have data which we can synthesize to provide the useful information that is also usable and actionable.
Thanks, Schwab. It seems a lot of what is coming out is that the people in the room, we need to be able to speak across all these different languages to make sense, which is quite a daunting task. Pearl, would you like to jump in on any thoughts around how we can better showcase what we're actually doing in Africa? We have a specific question for you as well. But if you'd like to have a go at a response to this question.
Okay, not specifically to your question, but I just had a thought when Jess was talking about scaling and when Schwab was talking about scaling. So we've had a bit of a debate, not a debate. We've had a bit of a trying to unpack scaling with one of our partners. Well, not one, just, with our partners, the Water Research Commission and Rhodes University, where we have looked at scaling in different forms. Where we've started a program we call Amanzi Etu Nobuntu that looks at a blended finance model for investing in ecological infrastructure across the catchment, but that's like a conversation for another day. But with this program, what has come up is how do we scale how do we scale this up? And we've kind of been very resistant to upscaling. We'd rather just call it scaling, because we see scaling in sort of different forms. There's depth scaling, which is looking deeply at what you're doing and learning lessons from it. So where you are. So there's still some depth scaling that we still need to do within the Umgeni catchment in terms of the work that we're doing and how we're doing it and how we improve it. And then there's also horizontal scaling that we need to do, which is how do we take what we're doing and work with other catchments so that they can learn from us in terms of what we do. So there's also that kind of horizontal scaling. There's also vertical scaling in terms of how do we take what we do at a catchment scale and channel it up to policy development and decision making and all of those higher structures and move across that sort of vertical scale. So we kind of see scaling in and all of this interplay. So your vertical scaling and depth scaling and horizontal scale all interplay, and they all feed into each other. So it kind of takes time to do all of that. So we usually find that most of the time with these pilot projects or programs, people want to scale too soon without understanding a lot. So without that depth scaling within their own space, and also without trying out the horizontal scaling with your neighbor and saying, how does this work for you? Before we can, move and make it a huge thing. So we've had those conversations around scaling, and I guess they're still going. It's still a debate, and it's not just a debate, it's still something we are trying out. So we're still working with other catchment in terms of saying, what can we learn from us and what can you learn from you? And then we're still working up across the policy space in terms of saying, what does what we are doing feed into the policy space, and also understanding ourselves within the catchment. What are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? So that's the one part I just wanted to share around scaling.
Super, Pearl. I think that that was a nice wrap up on the question of speaking up to policy, across to other areas, across to theory, neighboring catchments, a very nice example. There's a specific question for you, Pearl, while we have you here on the floor, from Dylan, who says, could you just explain very briefly what you mean by investing into human resources to benefit ecological infrastructure? If you could give a short answer to that one, and then I'll pick up on Minka's thread here as well.
All right. So in terms of investing in human resources, what we mean is basically capacity development, so strengthening human capacity. So we kind of strengthen human capacity in different ways. So there is strengthening human capacity at an individual level. There's also strengthening human capacity at an institutional level. So where we, at the different institutions, we kind of capacitate each other in terms of what we mean and what can we do in terms of investing in ecological infrastructure. And part of the capacity development, and something that we've just started now in 2020, is actually capacitating young people in the catchment in terms of managing and maintaining ecological infrastructure. Right now, we've got around 600 young people that we call EnviroChamps that are working across the catchment with different organizations, doing different interventions that are related to managing ecological infrastructure. So that's what we mean by, investing in human resources, because that requires time. It also requires financial resources, and it also requires people.
Super, thanks, Pearl. Excellent response. And I think the role of champions is something that comes up so often. There's a point from Ninka, that maybe this is all very much around sort of marketing, and we put forward terminology to advance or to gain traction with funders or finance people, etc. Would anyone in the panel like to respond to that? I mean, it's just a point, but if anyone feels they have a strong view on it, feel free to jump in. I mean, I think the role of funders has come up a few times. It's definitely it's a thing for sure, and using the right terminology to speak into the right pots of money, for sure.
Could I say something to add?
Please, yes, thanks, Ninka.
Yeah, I think perhaps I meant it in a different way. What you were asking at some point. Let me see. Weren't we doing it all along? What's the terminology about? And then I was thinking of other processes, and then I thought maybe when you are so familiar with it, and the term gets bombarded towards you, you think, we were doing it all along. So maybe for parties that are new to nature-based solutions, they have more the inclination to make it bigger. Yeah. Sorry, I find it difficult to bring it under words, and it's not my own language too.
No, you've done a great job, and I think you make an excellent point.
So I was thinking, for instance, you have the practice of foraging, and now it's hugely popular here in the Netherlands and in Britain. Everyone is foraging.
Yeah.
But when I asked my grandmother, she said, "Well, we didn't call it that way. I got my grocery, I got my plants and my berries from the shop and from the neighborhood, but I wasn't calling it foraging." I was thinking of that kind of examples.
Exactly. Yeah. No. A lovely example. Language shifting through time as well. Thanks, Ninka, for offering that clarity as well. There's a question from Kevin, which I think is quite an interesting one around language. So initially this was posed to Franklin, but on sort of consideration, Kevin has opened it up to everyone. I think, Kevin, I might be getting it wrong, but the question is, so the language deviates when we start talking about nature-based solutions and nature and how this is invoked in different communities. And Franklin made a really great case with sort of dialect variation across Dar es Salaam and Nairobi. And Kevin says, is the language around the challenges people face, is that also different? Or is that a more unified language? Is the sort of language of crisis and burden, is that a unified language, or is that also variable? Franklin, you can jump in on that one first because it was dedicated to you, but if anyone else would like to say something, please do.
Yes, thank you, Pippen, and thank you, Kevin, for that question. So I think I can weigh in on this, that I think we found a bit of a difference in sort of like the approach to how the language in defining the sort of the challenges around the nature-based, around the wastewater management, which is the area that we focused a lot more, and to start with actually our perspective of doing this in Dar es Salaam and Nairobi was for that different geographical context, and being able to develop and sort of inform how the examples of the different nature-based solutions come from these different contexts, coastal and the Nairobi, which is like on the sort of like highland geographical context. But then quickly we started to realize that also the different cultural differences also started to come out, even in how the approaches were discussed, or the examples were discussed, and solutions how they were developed. And I think one of the things that we quickly start to realize is sort of like language that builds acceptance, and the way people perceive or understand, the solutions sort of helps, relay an acceptance to the solutions that we're talking about. Anything that sounds super strange and super complicated sort of makes it even a bit more difficult to share across. So I feel, I think there's the language that was used, or the terms that people use in defining the challenges seem to cut across as very similar, but sort of like the language around how the solutions or what the solutions are, I think is different from the different cities. And I think that came out. And I think we might continue to see that a lot more, even as we continue to collect data from the monitoring and evaluation of that.
Thanks, Franklin. Very useful. Does anyone else want to chime in on language? I think Franklin also raises a new point. It's not new, so right at the get-go, Schwab kicked off making reference in passing to tracking progress. And Franklin also mentions now monitoring, and I'm very interested in how we might be losing things by shifting our terminology or our language. Or is that not a worry? Are we sufficiently dexterous not to worry about that? So any responses to Kevin's question around language of crisis? Or any thoughts around language and monitoring and language and tracking change through time?
Perhaps I just have a quick one, and it's a slight tangent, but just in terms of even the language, the way the question of Kevin's was phrased about, the same context around relating to challenges. And what we've been trying to do quite a lot is shift that nature-based solutions addressing challenges, but also nature-based solutions for opportunities and unlocking opportunities. And that's been really, really interesting in trying to see it as a positive and not just a kind of a plaster to various things. So I just thought that was a little interesting just in terms of chat, just because of things about language. So I wanted to add that.
Thanks, Jess. Is that well received, or is that?
It is well received. It is definitely well received, because I think the burden of service delivery in African cities is quite thing. So if you start to see it as, oh, it's complementary to the work I'm already doing, oh, it's unlocking other multitude of benefits, is quite a thing. Whereas rather just as a solution to just kind of tick box everything, all the other crises I'm dealing with, is quite liberating for them, for decision makers.
Interesting. Thanks, Jess. Any of our other panelists wanting to jump in on?
Pippen, Anita and Pearl have their hands up as well.
Oh, thanks, Bongi. That's super. Anita, we haven't heard from you. Would you like to jump in?
Thanks, Pippen. Hi, everybody. Yeah, just a quick musing. I guess I'm picking up a little bit on, this is just sort of like a thought, picking up on what Schwab and said right in the beginning around sort of, Schwab, you mentioned noise, and you had quite a cool term for it, micro level studies in Africa. And Jess, you picked up on the scale issue. And I was also wondering, if we think about large initiatives, large scale initiatives like the ecological infrastructure in KZN, or for example, Franklin, you would know the study in Dar es Salaam, the Msimbazi project. It's really, really big. And it's sort of very much government and World Bank supported, lots of partners. But then the other scale of the very local nature-based solutions, whether they call that or not, probably not at the local scale. And I was wondering about these two. I mean, there are obviously lots of scales at which this can happen, but I'm also wondering whether there's a language issue in the scale, because when you have the very larger initiatives, larger scale initiatives like Msimbazi, like ecological infrastructure in KZN, the language is more sort of aligned with policy and policymakers and decision makers and funders. Whereas perhaps I'm just wondering about this now, whether at the local level, the language is, and this is what some people are saying, like Kevin had a question, Franklin was talking about that also, their language language is more nuanced at that scale. And maybe that's also one of the reasons why we struggle to coordinate and communicate all of the value, because I think what I'm also thinking is the value of the local. There's obviously value in different scales of nature-based solutions, but if we can't communicate the value of the local, what Schwab called micro-level studies or micro-level benefits, then it's like we're losing that opportunity in Africa, because, you know, if you think about a household or a neighborhood level, it's at that level that people feel a lot of benefits. They feel the improved quality of life. They feel, they see and feel, they experience the improved provision of benefits and services. So I'm wondering also, you know, whether the local scale initiatives sort of get a bit lost, or they're there, but they live in sort of the local narrative, and they live in maybe the NGO narrative and the grey literature mostly. And for some reason, then we the language, perhaps we don't have a way of, and it's a double-edged sword, because you don't necessarily want to unify the language, because that's where those cultural differences come in. And I think that's quite a tricky one. But anyway, it's something cool to think about, these different scales and the languages at different scales. But yeah, thanks so much for the thoughts. This is super stimulating. Thanks to the great panel and the questions.
Thanks, Anita. Very useful musings. I think you've also managed to sum up quite a lot of what was being said in the thread around scale prior to that. I'm quite sure that there might be people who want to respond to that. So I'm going to ask Pearl to just hold off. I don't know, Schwab, if you're wanting to respond to that, or if we should just march on.
Yeah, thank you. Just a quick one. Thanks, Rita, for that observation. I think the way I see it, and the way possibly we need to think about it, perhaps, is when we talk about solutions, nature-based solutions at scale, we have to take into consideration some sort of gradation. There is a lot that can be done as opportunities at micro level, but there's also a lot that can be done at meso scale, and a lot perhaps that can be done at macro scale. Meso to macro scale is perhaps sits within the narrative of the policymakers and decision makers, whereas when it comes to micro, it resonates more with individuals and households and communities. So as academics and practitioners, we need to develop that framework that allows us to map different solutions along that gradation, so that the nuanced, as Anita said, the nuanced solutions that resonate with people don't get lost with the large-scale infrastructure. So this is not a criticism, but if you design a piece of infrastructure, as illustrated by Ingrid, in terms of treating waste from cities through piping instead of the ponds, perhaps not many people will actually value it. Not many people will even be able to see it in order to value it. But if you design that particular piece of infrastructure at that scale, but in addition, where appropriate, design much more decentralized, relatively smaller, perhaps neighborhood miniatures of that infrastructure, that directly resonates with many people, and they can value it, they can see it, and perhaps it deals with the problem also that Kevin raised, which about the language in different locations, which in my opinion is also very much context specific. So just an addition that we need to think about some form of gradation of solutions. Yeah.
Thank you, Schwab. Useful response. There may be others who want to pick up on the discussion around scale. I'm not shutting it down. There's lots of threads floating around for anyone to take up. I can't see raised hands, but I know that Pearl had a hand up. Do you want to jump in, Pearl? And Bongi, if you could let me know if people have raised hands. But Pearl, jump up.
First, I'm going to have to apologize for not having my video on. I've been displaced, so I'm running around. So I think what I wanted to pick up on was on Anita's point around language and you know, the local versus more, I don't know. So what I was trying to say is that for me, language is also context specific. Because what jumped at me when she was talking was the fact that we have just had floods, for example, in KZN in the last couple of weeks. So the sort of like the conversation and the language has sort of gravitated towards ecosystem-based adaptation because of context. So we do know that, you know, some of us are very much, our language is embedded in ecological infrastructure management and maintenance, but because of the context we're in now, that whole conversation is now driven by ecosystem-based adaptation. So I would also say, you know, sometimes language is also influenced by context.
Thanks, Pearl. So yeah, a useful reminder, and it's context and scale and language have come up again and again. You had your own example of Zulu elders. Franklin talked again about language. It's really, but how we work across that gradient, I think, is quite critical to really think about applying our minds to. And I think when we're in a room like this together, we're all in a beehive and we're all working at different scales, and it feels very happy and harmonious. But I'm not sure that it's always coming together in the ways that showcase the African continent, both to the world and also to Africa, in a way that, you know, really attends to some of the challenges on the continent. Are there any raised hands that I'm not seeing? Bongi?
No, none at the moment.
Okay, super. Would anyone else, is anyone sitting on a question they would like to? You're all feeling content. I'm scrolling through the participants and there's some super interesting people in the room. I think something that's coming up for me repeatedly is this notion of lots of important local work. And I think in particular, practitioners operating at that scale are generating incredible work. And I think the kinds of conversations that are emerging around being true to local language and local custom and local practice is very relevant to sort of projects of decolonization. How do we take that? Because we need to draw lots and lots and lots of little bits together to build larger understandings that we can roll out at scale. We can build theory that we can use in turn to understand the actions that are playing out on the continent. How do we take that very African base that is, I think as Shwe put it, it is in essence a pushback in a way. We're doing our thing in our language right here. How do we take that and effectively scale it up in a way that holds true and doesn't sell out to international funders or global North theory, etc. along the way? Maybe that's fine. Maybe that doesn't matter. Maybe it's okay. We just need to be true to ourselves and content that what we're doing here is using language that is inclusive, etc. So that's a thought from me, amusing more than anything else. But it feels like there's something emerging here in the conversation that speaks into this notion of decolonizing research and practice on the continent. Does that resonate with anyone or not?
If I can jump in, Pippen, thank you for bringing up the decolonization debate. And I think that it's really very, very important to also relate it with the language and how the academy and various topics, including ecology and nature-based solution, could benefit from a decolonizing agenda. I just want to highlight that when it comes to decolonization, I know it's a recently, kind of rejuvenated discourse. It is very much laden with, kind of feelings, and we have to be very careful about it, because I think it's also possibly getting hijacked to become some sort of development agenda or development debate. But for me, decolonization means, where do you start from? And most likely where you start from is me and everyone at individual level, our practices. We should appreciate and understand the imbalances in terms of power, and language as a medium of power. Think about the elders that Paul just talked about. If we go with ecological infrastructure, that already could intimidate in some ways the elders in that catchment, and that could kind of emit a certain level of power that could make them not contribute openly and honestly about what they think about what perhaps they already know and have done, but you call it completely something different. So for me, decolonization is a starting point, and it's everybody's responsibility to take those little steps to try and, as much as possible, deal with the power imbalances when we relate with people. And language is very important in transmitting this kind of power, either directly or indirectly.
Absolutely, absolutely agree with you. I see we are down to our last sort of 10 minutes. I'm going to put one last call out to the floor before I hit my panel with a last question. Is there anyone in the room who feels like they're sitting on something but has felt too nervous to raise their hand, or no?
Sorry to come back.
No, please jump in.
Nenka raised the issue of marketing and marketization. Yeah. And when she raised it, it reminded me of the very long-standing practice in Africa of organic agriculture versus inorganic agriculture, with the use of fertilizers and the carbon footprint of fertilizers. We still use fertilizers in Africa, but much less compared to other regions. And in reference to that example, we have also to be very strategic when we start thinking about marketization. I think there is a possibility for marketization to slip or to send the notions and the terminology that could be very inclusive from Africa into the global debate of marketization. And if there's any opportunity that involves resources and benefit financially, there are many other people that will latch on it and take it. Whereas for a very long time, unmeasured, organic agriculture has contributed to the people in Africa. We can debate it in another meeting, but Africa still arguably feeds itself, and much of the agrarian system is still very much organic agriculture. That benefit has not been measured, and therefore we have yet to marketize it, if it is necessary to marketize it. So we have to be very strategic about that. So that's why I'm touting another point, that when it comes to no regret, we must make sure that whatever is framed as no regret does not become burdensome to the rural Africans or urban Africans who have for long benefited from nature's contribution. So again, I'm sorry to sound like I'm pushing back on many things from the language point of view, but I think it's very important that we really are strategic when it comes to marketization. It has to be of benefit to Africa first.
Absolutely, absolutely. Very well said. I have a question from Peter, who asks explicitly on the topic of urgency, how do we avoid jargon getting in the way of action? I'm going to hand this one first to Jess, because she said, she raised this as a point where language is seen as a delay tactic. Jargon, barrier to action, Jess?
I knew you would go to me, and I got worried because it's a hard question to answer. But I think I think what we've seen is that first point that I made, that language is important, but the meaning behind the use of the languages is equally as important. And if we can really provide those spaces to unpack what they meant by a certain terminology, or why they chose that word, or why they have an affinity, it's quite a lever. It levers the pay. Was it? It leverages the playing field, levels the playing field, to really understand where somebody's coming from, and kind of, because it starts to get really into like their values and all the rest of it, which is very important. So I think that's one of the key things, but also, and I know it's very much in the climate debate as well, like climate data, what's actually happening in the projections, and how do they overcome that uncertainty. And it's very much about co-producing knowledge together, and understanding that what's in the risk of acting, and what can be acted despite this debate about language, and then what is the really things that we need to kind of have one consolidated understanding or terminology. So I think you can also act within a risk scope, and that's what we can try and unpack in those co-production spaces.
Super, thanks, Jess. Franklin or Pearl or Shoaib, do any of you want to add to the question around jargon as a stumbling block? Franklin?
Yeah, I could go. Yeah, thanks, Pippen. I think there's a critical role that language is going to continue to play, and I think the way the language is used by the different stakeholders will always vary. And I think that as we work from small scale, from community level interventions, we're building a different language or jargon around that, but also relaying that in terms of academic or sharing that across other practitioners is also will require its own form of language. And I think, as has been mentioned before, we've had like there's also a language that we use when you're talking to like funding partners. But I think I would want to first like appreciate like the role, for example, that ICLEI is playing in developing, like breaking down the language and the jargon from HV solutions into a language that is understandable, and also the role that cities is playing from that global perspective in terms of like breaking down this really global goals and language and bringing that into our spheres, and the same thing across. So that there's also continued support for good practice. I think there's a role and a language for each of these levels to be able to relay in general solutions and sort of like the good practices. I think what we shouldn't turn away from is what we want to achieve from all this, and we could be able. There's a way we can all collaborate from the different levels we're working in, and from the different spaces and perspectives that we approach this, to be able to co-produce and build these physical interventions, establish learning, and even find a way to disseminate it across within the African cities, and even beyond that to the different stakeholders, governments and other practitioners in the region and across. And like that form of communication has to be there. And being able to create that awareness, share the approaches, be able to learn from each other. And I think for our particular case, for example, I think working in formal settlement has been a sphere where we found there's a gap of knowledge in terms of ecosystem-based solutions, and trying to understand that and see is there actually a gap? Are there things that people are doing that we could bring out and sort of be an intermediary between this small scale bottom level approach and sharing that up into other spheres, academics and other practitioners, and also sort of facilitate the process of upscaling, and also facilitate other efforts around top-down approaches and also the bottom-up approaches in terms of achieving what we would want in terms of use of nature-based solutions. And I think in that case, for example, here in KDI, in relation, in addition to the website that we, and I think I'll share that link in here. in addition to the website. And I've seen, the different organizations represented here are doing the same thing, being able to share this across on web pages or in other platforms. In addition to that, we're also trying establishing a community of practice for the region, and I'm quite excited that the diversity of the panel and also the audience here, and I'd welcome you to also join that regional community of practice. I think it will be helpful, one, to interact with what we are sharing there, but also give you the opportunity to be able to share across and help share across all this information in the different languages as we've spoken right now. Yeah, thanks so much.
Super. Thanks, Franklin. I'm going to abandon the language question now. We have got 3 minutes left. I've got one last question for our panelists, and I want a straight yes or no answer. It'll be a sentence, but I don't need an elaboration. The question is, so Joseph Mulligan has raised in the chat the notion that we are not necessarily trained for this. Maybe we are, but clearly everybody on this panel is very dexterous. We move across scales. You speak to communities, to policy, to academia, to funders. So my question to you is, do you feel in your formal training that you were trained to be what Joe calls a system integrator, or what I would call a knowledge broker? So last comment, do you feel you were trained to do the kind of interlanguage, interscale practice that you do on a daily basis? Quick answers from everyone. Franklin.
Yes, I do, and sort of in the process of doing that as well.
Okay, good answer. Pearl.
The honest truth is no, I wasn't. It's kind of something I always say. It's what I do. It's who I am. It's kind of something that I just do. And I've kind of like gained some training in along the way. But I am a natural scientist, and I wasn't trained to do this. It's in me to do it.
In you. Schwabe, your reflections on this one?
I wasn't trained to do this, but I've been humbled by my own experience working across multiple scales. I think of myself as now in the position of bridging local to global. And I broker knowledge at macro, very local scale, but also international scale. So it's very humbling to be part of this process and journey of learning. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks, Schwabe. It's a journey for sure. Jess.
Yes, but no training can compare to the baptism by fire of actually being in those kind of boundary spaces. And that's where we really learn.
Super. Thank you so much for those final reflections. I think it's very interesting to think how we ourselves engage with language across these different, what Schwabe talked about, these gradients of people and society and concepts, etc. Lots and lots of really interesting thoughts. I won't give a summation. I think you're all left with stuff to mull over, which is super useful. It only remains for me to thank this fantastic panel. I'm very sorry we didn't have Sierra Leone, but really, Jess, Schwabe, Franklin, and Pearl, that was really, really wonderful. Your insights and your willingness to share with us was very, very generous. Thank you so much. And to everybody else, enjoy the rest of the RISE event. There's so many exciting things going on, and I'll catch some of you there. Thanks so much. And thanks to the tech team as well. Cheers all.